So the first topic we'll be looking at today is called activities-based management. And it basically encompasses everything in this left section of the cheat sheet. So in activities-based management, you're basically looking at all the activities a company performs and evaluating whether you should keep them, reassess them, improve them, or eliminate them. So to do this, you have to first find out two criteria of each of the activities the company does. So the first is to determine whether each activity is strategic or non-strategic. So a strategic activity is an activity that is considered helpful to one of the company's main goals or objectives. A non-strategic activity is an activity that is considered not helpful to one of the company's main goals. So a quick example is this. So let's say an oil company has the goals of making money and not seeming evil. So those are the two big goals. And their activities here are, number one, to design efficient something to increase revenue. That would be called strategic because it directly correlates with the goal of making money. The second activity could be create ads to improve the company image. That would also be strategic because it helps them to not seem evil. Now the third activity is to recycle all of their something in order to be more eco-friendly. Now, even though we all know that recycling and being eco-friendly is a very good thing, because it's not listed as one of these oil companies' main goals, it is not strategic. So that would fall into this not strategic pile. So that is the first criteria you'll have to look at for each activity. And that's kind of the simplest part of these questions, just figuring out whether they're strategic or non-strategic. Now the second part is where we really have to dive into the math. And that is to determine whether they are performed well, not performed well, or I guess not performed, but you don't need math for this part. So we'll kind of get into that in a second. But once you figure out whether they're strategic, non-strategic, performed well, or not performed well, you have to plug them into this chart here. So if you have an activity that is not performed well, yet is strategic, you want to improve the activity. You want to make it better. If you have a activity that is not performed well, yet is not strategic, then you need to just eliminate it, because there's no point in doing something you're bad at if it's not even helping your company's goals. Now, if you have an activity that's performed well but is strategic, you want to keep that activity just as it is because you're doing a good job at it. But if you're doing an activity that you're performing well yet is non-strategic, you might want to reassess. Because if you're doing something really well yet it's not in your company's main objectives, then maybe you can make one of their main objectives that activity. So maybe this oil company is really good at being eco-friendly. Maybe that will be one of their big goals, although that's probably not going to happen for an oil company. Now, this is kind of the last section in this, and it's not, I don't really know how relevant this is for the exam, but let's say you have a strategic activity that you're not doing, that you're not performing at all. You, of course, want to add that activity. So if you have a goal and there's a strategic activity that can help you reach that goal and you're not doing it, you might want to start doing it. Now, to determine whether an activity is performed well or not performed well, you're going to have to kind of go through all of these three main charts here, and then possibly a fourth at the very end. So all these are just looking at all of the main costs and then seeing how these costs are split up between activities and then determining the total cost of the activities at the end and comparing them to a benchmark. So let's just kind of start with these charts, and that'll probably make more sense as we continue. So this first chart is arguably the most difficult, and it's just looking at all of the costs and deciding what percent of each cost gets distributed to each activity. So this is the percent chart. So first, on the left-hand side, you're going to want to make a list of all of the main costs that are included in these activities. So that'll generally include directors, workers, and rent. So next you want to kind of list the cost driver. So directors, people are paid based off their time, so their cost driver is almost always time. I would say it's always time basically. And for things like rent, the more space or the more square feet you take up in a building, the more money of rent that you are consuming. So that is a cost driver here. So for each of the activities, so then after you have these costs listed to the left, you're going to then want to write out all the activities at the top. So activity B, activity A, and activity C. So the first thing you want to do is just now split up the percent of each cost into each activity. So for the director, the question may say the director spends 20% of their time on activity A, 60% on activity B, and 20% on activity C. So you would simply just give activity A 20% of the director, activity B gets 60%, and activity C gets 20% also. It'll probably be a little more difficult on the exam. It'll probably say something like the director spends so-and-so hours throughout the day doing this and the remaining doing that, or something like that. Next is the workers. So you're going to do the same thing, but the way you distribute these percents is probably going to be more like there are 10 workers, in quotations, there are 10 workers, and 3 out of the 10 workers do activity A. So 30% of the workers do activity A. And I'll say like the remaining workers work on activity B. So the 7 out of 10 work on activity B. So yeah. And finally, you have rent. Now rent is a little more difficult. So I'm going to kind of break this down theoretically first, and then I'll kind of show you the equation. So whether visuals or equations work better for you, we're going to kind of go through both of them to explain this. So in a question, as I said, rent is generally determined using square feet. So a question may say something like 10 out of 100 square feet are given for the directors, and the remaining square feet is for the workers. Therefore, you know that the directors get 10% of the rent, and the workers get 90% of the rent. So you can't just say, because that doesn't say anything in terms of activity A, you can't really do anything in the box for rent. So then you need to figure out, okay, if the director gets this percent of the rent, how much of the director's time is spent on activity A? And you kind of have to put that into rent, and we'll make more sense of that with the visual. So let's say this is a building with 100 square feet. Let's say 10 feet of that is for the director, and the remaining 90 feet are for the workers. Now, this director here, let's just pretend that they use up 50% of their time on activity A. Now, because they use up 10% of the space and 50% of their time is on activity A, we know that 5% of the total space is used for the director for activity A. Now, the workers use up 90% of the space. The workers here. And just to make this really simple for me, I'm going to pretend that every single worker devotes all of their time to activity A. Therefore, all 100% of their space is activity A, and therefore 90% of their space is for activity A for the workers. So if we add those two together, the 90 plus the 95 means 95% of the total rent is for activity A. Okay? And just to break that down mathematically for this exact scenario, that would simply be the 10% of the director's space multiplied by that 50% the director spends on activity A plus the 90% of the worker's space multiplied by the 100% of time they spend on activity A. And that will give you 95%. And to put this in your calculator, that would simply be 0.1 times 0.5 and so on. Okay, so that is how do you figure out the percents for rent. And there may be other things that are distributed amongst workers, such as they might use laptops, and we'll actually use that in our example. So if something is distributed among workers or among different people that are working on the activity, you want to kind of allocate it based on that. So again, this is just what that equation just showed. In this example, again, we're using 10% of the space for director times their 20% used for activity A and 90 for workers, but in this time it's 30% for activity A, 29%. So that is arguably the hardest part of all of these charts. Now, the second chart is very similar to the first, but instead of using percents, we're using money now. So again, you still want to list all of the main costs to the side, but this time, next to them, you want to list the total amount of money your company spends on each cost. So in this example, the director takes up around $100 each year. More likely that's like $100,000, but just for the sake of simplicity, let's say 100. Now, because earlier we figured out that the director spends 20% of their time doing activity A, we know that if the day in whole costs $100 and they spend that 20% on activity A, then in total, activity A for the director costs $20. We just took that total cost for the director, multiplied times their time spent on activity A to give you the total cost for director for activity A. And you're going to do the same for the rest of the activities and then for the rest of the costs. And then at the very end, you're going to add these up. So add this up, and this up to find the total cost for each activity. And in total, they should equal the total of all the costs put together. So you can just double check it real quick. Okay, so the final chart is just to compare it to your industry. So if you're doing an activity well, then that means you're doing it at the same cost of your competitors, or you're doing it for cheaper. And this is assuming that all activities are done at the same level of quality. So if you're doing the same activity at the same level of quality, but you're doing it at a lesser expense than your competitors, then you're doing a good job. And if you're doing the same activity, but you're spending more on it than your industry or than your competitors, then you're not performing it well. So in this example, activity A takes up $225, whereas the industry takes up $250. Because you spend less than your competitors on it, you're performing it well. For activity B, you're spending more, so you're not performing it well. And for activity C, you're spending less, so you're performing it well. Now we just want to plug these back into our chart up here. Remember, for activity A, we said we're performing it well. Now let's just assume for this example that it's a strategic activity. So in this case, you would want to keep activity A. For activity B, let's say it's not performed well. It was not performed well. Now let's say it's non-strategic, so you would want to eliminate activity B. And that would be your answer. Now, one little thing they could do also here that I didn't touch on yet is instead of making you compare the total cost of the activity to your industries, they may ask you to do it via a cost driver. And if they do that, it's just a simple step you have to add on. So in this case, they say activity cost is A, and let's say you did 10 A's, so maybe your activity is a purchase order. So you had 10 purchase orders, therefore it costed $22.5 per purchase order, and it usually costs your industry $25 per purchase order. Therefore, you're still performing it well. It's just kind of different because of that cost driver quantity. Okay, so that is activities-based management. Now let's try this with a question.